Hey everybody, Ty here. I hope everyone is doing well, and I hope you all are looking forward to this one especially. We talked about this last month, and this is going to be pretty much a revisement since we've had a new outlook come in for winter here. We did want to do this originally on the 16th, but we were covering severe weather at the time, and we got to cover the more urgent stuff first here. That's how we do it on this channel. But I do apologize that I wasn't able to get this up faster, but better late than never. But this is the latest that we have for our winter outlook here. So, in the last one that we did back in September, which is our first looks, or I guess you could call it a preview, we went over some of the signals that we were already observing. We already knew that at this point we were going to be dealing with, at least for the first half, a La Nina winter through the early part and maybe shifting towards neutral Enzo. So at this point, the outlook's kind of doubled down on that signal at this point. We're starting to see the northern states have a slightly higher confidence in that below average temperature signal here. It's not really surprising to see that. Also, the overall coverage has increased a bit, and it's now leaning a little bit more into some of the Midwestern territories as well. So we've had an increase in confidence there. And then even for the warmer than average temperatures over here, we've had a slight signal boost over here towards the southwest and over towards the southern panhandle of, or the southern peninsula of Florida here. Panhandle has remained pretty much the same at this point. A couple other interesting details to make note of here is looking over towards Alaska. One point we were looking at the Gulf of Alaska and the Aleutian Islands here, looking like we're going to be slightly below average. Now we're starting to see an above average signal begin to pop up there. And then over towards the south and eastern part of the state, we're looking at below average temperatures. Reason why I always make a big deal out of this area is mainly due to the fact that whatever we see over towards southeast Alaska usually translates into what we end up seeing towards the northwestern states. And again, as we mentioned before, if you've seen the diagram for a La Nina winter, this is pretty textbook, I would say, at this point. Above average temperatures towards the southwest and the southern states as a whole here. Towards the northeast, it can be a little bit of a battle zone here, and maybe even the mid-Atlantic as well. But over towards the northern states and also over towards the northwest, we see the below average temperatures here. And if we were to go a little bit further in the range, so we're going to even include January, February, and March here, you can see that we've kind of doubled down with the signal on this as well. In regards to our temperatures, we've had a little bit of a drop off at this point in regards to our our above average temperature likelihoods, but not too dissimilar from what we were seeing for that first 3 month time frame of December, January, and February. And what's significant about March is typically where we start to see the meteorological shift heading into spring. But the official start to spring is technically March 22nd. So if we even go ahead and look further right towards the very end of that 3 month span heading into what would officially be spring, so we'll even skip this all the way up to like April. Not much really changes here. This does lead me to a degree of intrigue on quite a few levels, especially in regards to what we could see towards the back half of winter. And there's some really interesting signals that I'm going to show you in a little bit that would kind of back up my thoughts on this just looking at the outlook alone. So, did not mean to click that. We're going to take a look at the precip maps. And again, this is kind of typical of what you would see with a weak La Nina here. But the one thing I want to remind everyone, especially when we have those weak La Nina phases, when you have weak La Nina to neutral Enzo or even weak El Ninos, they tend to go a little bit astray of what the expected norm would be with, let's say, a stronger El Nino or La Nina phase. So the stronger the phase, the more likely you are to see something that's a little bit more in lines of what would be considered textbook. So there's going to be some variabilities here and there. So if you're looking at these precip maps, you're looking at these temperature outlook maps, the other thing to remember outside of the norm, which we already know, we already talk about this pretty much every video, that we're looking at a 90-day average. 30 and 90-day averages do not really tell the whole story as to what every day could be like. There's going to be some opportunities here and there towards northeastern states, even towards the southeastern states where we have these below average precipitation signals, where we could see maybe even potential for winter weather. All of this will, of course, depend on the conditions at that moment in time, of course. But just based off of what we're seeing here, based off the long range pattern that we're going to be expecting, or predominant pattern, looks like the Ohio Valley is going to be very active. And I do expect a few cold blasts to come in here and there for this region in particular. So I think that there will be times where we end up seeing a little bit more along the lines of wintry precip, and most likely going to be ending up seeing a lot of this be, well, above average. Same thing for these regions over here towards Montana and a lot of the mountains in this area. Now, again, as we mentioned before, with a weak La Nina, it's not really surprising to see the Southwest kind of quiet down. It's been very busy over here lately, and I'm sure a lot of people have been cool with it for the most part, unless you've been dealing with the flash flooding at times, which has been a bit sketch. We'll probably start to see things really begin to calm down towards the end of this current month, heading into November and beyond. And also another thing to make note of here, as we get into November and December, it's not uncommon to see these areas really start to quiet down. We do have a brief period, which is technically considered like secondary severe season, that happens between October and November. It's not a long spanning stretch, but usually after that, we kind of dry out over here towards the deep south and southeast as well. So pretty normal signal. Usually during an El Nino pattern, we kind of see the opposite. We'll see a slightly enhanced chance of precipitation there. But typically with the La Nina, it tends to be a bit drier. The storm track tends to be a little bit further towards the north. And I would expect to see, for the most part, something pretty similar again. But remember what I said earlier. Weak La Ninas don't always go by the textbook here. They don't like to go by the rules. And another really interesting thing, if we go ahead and look at the precip pattern up towards the northwest and over towards Alaska, the northern and western half of the state looks relatively active compared to the southeastern part of the state. But I do think that in large part we're going to see a little bit more in the way of ridging up towards this region. But that also could lead to an increase in confidence for more troughing to occur towards the western U.S. And what's interesting about that is the deeper that ends up pushing, the higher the probability that it's drier over towards southeastern Alaska. So seeing this signal is pretty interesting in its own right. And if we follow up with the upcoming months beyond this first 3-month time frame here, we see a signal that's relatively identical as to what we've been seeing up to this point. Maybe not quite the same extent of confidence as we've had, let's say, towards December, January, and February, but the signal remains pretty consistent across the board here. Now, one thing that we like, just like what we talked about with the Enzo phase that we're going to be in, notice that as we go further through the winter months here, we'll see this signal trend back towards 0.0 degrees Celsius here. So this is the start of our winter time frame right here where I'm moving my cursor. This is December, January, February, and we're already close to being right at the edge of being out of that La Nina phase. By the time we get towards the middle part of winter, it looks like we're shifting out of that possibly. Now this could get extended into January and February. Time will only tell with that. But it does look like we end up seeing a warming trend. And this teleconnection has a major influence on our weather as a whole. Usually when we're in more of a neutral trend, the weather actually becomes even more unpredictable because there aren't as many data points for a neutral phase in comparison to, let's say, what is a La Nina in this case, which would be negative 0.5 degrees Celsius or lower, or positive 0.5 degrees Celsius and above, which is an El Nino phase. So we're going to be kind of sitting right in the middle as we head closer and closer towards spring. And it's there where I think the weather really might start to take a turn here. It's always more in that transition point is where things really start to get a little bit wacky. We kind of saw that with severe weather season last year. And it wouldn't surprise me if we were to see some crazy winter weather coming into play as well. And just in case you wanted to be sure here, here's a look at our ENSO probabilities. The blue here obviously is our La Nina. We have very good confidence as we head into December, January, February, but look at what happens with the neutral phase and how that comes into play as we get towards the tail end of winter. So again, I think that transition point, whenever it may come, could really throw things out of whack here. And if I'm taking a look honestly at some of the other oscillations or teleconnections that we're looking at here, the two that kind of stand out to me typically would be the AO or Arctic oscillation up here and the NAO or North Atlantic oscillation right here. We're in a negative phase predominantly through the month of December from the looks of it. But there's also another feature that I'm watching right here. And it's usually whenever I see a warm air mass like this that has a really strong signal, such as this one, where I get really suspicious of Arctic outbreaks, polar vortexes coming into play. This is a signal for some stratospheric heating. I saw that signal before we got into this little cold snap right here. There might be an even bigger signal as we head towards the very end of this month for maybe Halloween and heading into early November. So I see the signal kind of re-emerging a bit here as we get into December, and it does lead me to have some suspicion. And then of course right after that signal begins to diminish, look at that little blob of cold air that sets itself up here. Now there is a trough right here that looks like it keeps most of this at bay, but if it were to weaken, we get cold air to seep through, especially over towards the eastern half of the US. And if the storm track is right, which it very well could be, especially towards the northern states, I think we end up seeing a lot of wintry weather as a result of this. And depending on the strength of those storm systems with this warm air mass in place, there may be a couple of opportunities for severe weather. Of course, looking at this range, I can't have confidence in much of anything, but I'm just going off of what I'm seeing here. Like I said, this is where winter really starts to get wacky, especially as we get towards January and February. You start to see a reemergence of a very similar signal coming into play once again. And again, like I said, whenever we get these little negative phased AOs and NAOs, that cold air tends to find its way a little bit further towards the south and sometimes towards the east. You end up getting those episodes with polar vortex, it only makes it go further south. So as a result here, even as we head into March, there's some variability here in which I think that we could have a couple sneaky events that would really start to make our winter pretty dramatic here in regards to both maybe severe weather, winter weather, cold snaps, winter storms, just about whatever you could think of. You can't rule anything off of the table just yet. So based off what I'm seeing, if we were to go ahead and take a look at the temperature map for the lower 48, you can kind of see that for the most part, if things stay as they are based off of early CFS data, we're predominantly above average, with the exception, of course, of the northern states. But like I said, I do think there's a lot of adjustability with these forecasts. And the most telling piece of that is actually in the precip anomaly forecast here. Now, obviously, these areas in the yellow, we're looking at below average precip anomalies, and the areas in the green are above. Now, here's where things get interesting, is when we get into January, it gets really active here towards the deep south and over here towards the southwest. And if you remember what we were just talking about earlier with a La Nina phase, typically we don't see this too quickly, but it's a weak La Nina that's shifting back to a neutral ENSO. So we're definitely not looking at the textbook La Nina phase here at this point. So it's in that point of transition where I think things start to really kind of go awry here with our weather possibly. Like I said, it's not a situation where we can confirm, oh, this is the doom and gloom scenario or anything like that. But the signal here kind of verifies what we're thinking could occur, I should say, at this point. We're definitely not looking at the norm. And then an interesting signal again as we get towards the very end of winter and into spring, showing a lot of activity, enhanced rainfall over towards the deep south going forward. Now, of course, there's other parameters, other teleconnections that we could look at, but we could end up making this video almost like 2 hours long as a result of that. So we're not going to go into too heavy a detail, also due to the fact that at this range, any of those variables shifting could pretty much ruin the outlook at this point. So we'll wait till we get a little bit closer into range, especially in the month-to-month sense, and then we'll kind of go on from that point. But again, these signals definitely lead me to think that that back half of winter, especially with the potential for a polar vortex or two with increased precip over here towards these eastern states, could lead to potentially larger snow events as well. The potential at this point, at least, is there. So an interesting thing that I've also found, and anyone that's above, I would say 40 and into 50, I'm not trying to sneak this or anything like that, anyone that's at that 40 to 50 year old age time frame here, some of you may remember the winter of 1985 and into 1986. The reason why I make mention of that is the January outbreak that occurred back then. There was a big cold snap that broke records in regards to our temperatures as far south as Macon, Georgia, which is all the way down here towards like south central Georgia. Yeah, this is the Arctic outbreak between January 18th and 22nd. This was caused by a polar vortex. The reason why I make mention of it is, while obviously I wouldn't say that this is exactly what could occur here, the analog is very similar. Because if you were to go back and take a look at our graph here, look where the green and the purple lines intersect. It's right at that negative 0.5 degrees Celsius within that 3-month time frame here. And then if you look at this again, here's 1984, 85, 86 right here. Look at the numbers that we have right here. We have a -1 and a negative 0.5. So we're within that range here. And if we were to go off of 85 and 86, numbers are matching. And again, with the signal that we saw earlier, depending on how significant that polar vortex is, we could see something along these lines. It's not to be ruled out at this point. But the reason why I want to make sure that I make mention of this is we want to be prepared for the worst case scenarios, just in case they do happen, but hopefully the best will occur. But the goal here at the end of the day is to keep you ahead, not to scare you. But either way, it does look like this winter could be a little bit more on the wily side, possibly. So again, definitely want to make sure you're preparing yourselves accordingly if you do end up being in a situation where you may have to stay in the house or just have to stay warm. But that being said, I'm going to call this one a video. I appreciate you all tuning in, and I will see you guys tomorrow. Whether we do a video on the tropics or severe weather, we'll figure that out when we get there. But until then, everyone, take care and have a wonderful rest of your night, and I'll see you next time.